Get a lot of back feed there. Well, thank you again for being here. We're up to lesson 6 in our walk through Matthew, and today we're going to actually step back a little, and you know the Gospels, Matthew included in there. There's a lot of interaction between Jesus and his disciples, so I thought today we would actually just kind of take a dive into his disciples themselves, take a look at who they are, what we know about them. Some of them we know a lot about them. They wrote books. Others we really know hardly anything about, which is interesting. So we'll take a look at that today and see what we can learn about see what we can learn about the apostles. All right, so just some background. If you look up Webster, what they say about an apostle is one of authoritative New Testament groups sent out to preach the gospel and made up especially of Christ's 12 original disciples. And we know Paul later on calls himself an apostle. Plus we had Matthias that came on. But most of the Bible deals with just the 12 original. The Greek word for that is apostolos, which means an envoy, an ambassador, or a messenger commissioned to carry out the instructions of the commissioning agent. And in this example, or in the Bible, obviously, it'd be Jesus Christ, who's that commissioning agent. This word appears around 79 times in the New Testament. If you notice, 10 in the Gospels, 28 in the book of Acts, 38 in the epistles, and 3 times in Revelations. And something I found interesting, in Hebrews 3, verses 1 through 2, Christ himself is even called an apostle, where it says, "Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Jesus Christ, who was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was faithful in all of his house." So again, if we look back at that example, or the definition, a messenger, you know, the apostles were carrying out the calling of Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ, of course, was carrying out the calling of who? His Father. All right, so this is just a list. All 4 Gospels have a similar list. We'll see today that a few of the apostles are called by different names in different books. But here's Matthew's version of it. Now, the names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas, and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and hope I'm saying this right, Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. And I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but Matthew's writing this, but Matthew's the only one that is mentioned as what their job is, or what their livelihood was. So it makes me wonder why he included that. There may have been a couple of reasons, but I'm thinking maybe it was just kind of a humbling thing, just to kind of once again remind himself that how far he had come, going from a tax collector now to being one of Jesus' apostles. All right, the calling. So before I do this, I have to tell you a joke today. And hopefully, I think I may even have heard it here, so I apologize if you've heard this, but it fits in. When I heard it, I thought, you know, it kind of fits in really good with the calling of the apostles. So a man walks into a pet store and he tells the owner there, he says, "I want a pet that is different from anything anybody ever has. I want something that nobody has." So the pet store owner thought for a minute. He said, "I think I got just the thing." So he goes back, and a couple minutes later, he comes back with his glass jar, and in it is just a big centipede sitting there. And the guy, first of all, looks at him and says, "You know, is a centipede really a pet?" And he kind of went on, but he said, "Wait a minute, though. This centipede talks." So I said, "Oh, well, that's perfect. I don't think anybody has a talking centipede." So he runs it home, puts it up on his bar as he walks in, and he says, "Mr. Centipede, would you like to go to the park and go for a walk?" And there's silence. So he thinks, well, maybe it just didn't hear me. So he said, well, I'll knock on it. He says, Mr. Centipede, talks a little louder. Would you like to go to the park and go for a walk? Silence. Now he starts thinking, well, surely this guy didn't just rip me off and I just paid all this money for just a plain old centipede. So he says, I'm going to try it one more time. This time I'm going to talk even louder. So he's banging on the glass there. You know, it's Mr. Centipede, would you like to go for a walk in the park? And after a little delay, the centipede looks back at him and says, yes, I would like to go for a walk in the park. It just takes me a long time to get all my shoes on. So when I heard that, I thought, you know, that's kind of like the calling, I think. The apostles are just, here they are doing their daily work, living their lives, and some man walks up to them and says, follow me. And I've often wondered, you know, what went through their minds, how their reaction was, and we'll take a look at that in a minute and kind of come up with just conjectures on what it was like for Jesus to come up and do that or ask that. So we'll look at how the ones that we don't know all the callings of them. We've got the calling of Simon, Peter, and Andrew in 4:18 through 20. It says, and Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And they immediately left their nets and followed him. Similar story with James, the son of Zebedee, and John. Then the following two verses, it says, going on from there, so he just talked to Peter and Andrew. He saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. In the boat was Zebedee, that was their father, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. So this seems like possibly there was some kind of maybe a family business that they were a part of with their dad. Fishing. All right, and Philip. And so today there was something I was trying to do with these lessons was really try to stick to Matthew and not go into a lot of the other Gospels. But for a lot of this information, Matthew really doesn't tell us some of this, so I've had to look in some of the other Gospel accounts. And Philip here, we find out in the book of John, verses 43, it says, the following day Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, follow me. Isn't it interesting that that's really all? I mean, we're assuming that's the conversation, but that's all that Jesus had to say was follow me, and they stopped and followed him. A couple verses past that, John 1:45, we see Bartholomew, who's also known as Nathanael. It says, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. All right, for Thomas, he's one of several that there's no recorded of his calling. Of course, Matthew records his own calling in chapter 9, verse 9, when he says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, follow me, and he arose and followed him. These next four more that we really don't have any record of their calling. James, the son of Alphaeus, he's also known as James the Lesser, Labas or Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot. None of those four do we really have any. So here's some questions that just came to my mind as I was thinking about this in the calling. Think about what was it about Jesus as you're thinking about that would have made these men immediately say yes. What do you think the reaction was from their family and friends to this news? Do you think? Because I've tried to put myself in this place, and I could just imagine if I came home, say tomorrow afternoon after work, and told Stephanie that I'd met some guy at work, and that I was going to leave and follow him. You know, I doubt she would take it too serious at first. She'd probably say, well, where are you going to go follow him to? You know, if I said, well, I'm going to join his ministry or whatever, and and I'm going to quit my job, and I'm going to not be around anymore. You know, I think that would be an odd, I think that would be obviously a difficult thing for any of us to have to do. And I've thought about these guys, how much they faced when they were called like this. Other questions I thought about, how often were they with Jesus? Do you think as apostles they were with him all the time? Because we're going to look in a minute at the map of where they were from. So most of them were pretty close to where most of Jesus' ministry was at. Do you think they spent every day with Jesus? Did they spend a few days? Did they go home at times? What about support for their families? I think that would be a big one. Were they able to support? The only one that we really know of as being married was Peter, but we do know, so we can make some kind of assumption there may have been others that were married or had a family. Were they able to support them? Did they have time to still do their jobs? We looked at when he talked about they left their father, 2 of them. Did they continue to help their father at all, or was he just at a loss for them? What about what things did they give up and lose because of their answer of yes to Jesus? They probably lost, obviously, they could have lost their jobs. Matthew, I'm sure, lost his job, or he did lose it, or would have walked away from it. Others, I'm sure, had jobs, the fishermen. What about the friends, how it affected their friends and their family? What about their future that they had to give up? Some of them Matthew may have been on a pretty good pathway to become important as a tax collector. The others maybe had to give up good jobs. And what about just their life? At the time, they didn't know it, but we're going to look at that later. But almost every one of them ended up giving up their lives for Jesus. So there was a lot to that answer of yes when they said that, and when Jesus asked them to follow him, and they did it. But again, on the opposite side, how did this decision change their lives for the positive? If you remember, Jesus told them they were promised some things in eternity that was different. I don't really understand it fully, but they're promised to be having 12 thrones to rule from those thrones. I don't know what that entails, but that seems to be kind of a special thing set aside for just the apostles. All the things, all the things they got to witness because of that decision, the things they got to see. And getting to know that as part of your life, you got to spend 3 years with God himself, the Savior. That's an incredible thing. I know this is kind of hard to see. I figured it kind of would be. But this is just well, it's okay. The one in the back you can hardly see, but that one's a little better. So this is, from what we can tell in my best reckoning, this is where each of the apostles was from. And if you look up at the map up there in Galilee, so Bethsaida kind of wins the award for the most apostles mentioned. And if you look up there at the Sea of Galilee, it's up on the northeast edge of the Sea of Galilee, up in Galilee. Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel, was from Cana in Galilee, so it's just kind of toward the bottom of the area of Galilee. Thomas is just mentioned as being from Galilee. Matthew, it mentioned Capernaum, but we don't know for sure if he was from Capernaum or that's just where he was. At the time when he was doing his tax collector, he may have been assigned to that area, but it just mentions he was from Capernaum. Excuse me. James, the son of Alphaeus, just mentions Galilee, so that's just kind of a broad term. We don't know doesn't mention anywhere about Labius or Thaddeus, where he's from. Simon, it mentions from Galilee. And Judas Iscariot doesn't really say what they do know is that the word Iscariot can mean Kirioth, and there is a town called Kirioth way down in Judea. It's not on the map because I couldn't find a map that actually included that town. But it's possible that his last name means he's from Judea, which would have placed him as the only apostle from anywhere other than up in Galilee. So let's take a look now kind of at some of the things we know. Some of these these men, there's so much in there. I just picked out a few things. Others you'll see there's really not much that we know about them other than their calling. Again, Peter from Bethsaida, John 1:44. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. We're told he worked as a fisherman, obviously in Capernaum when he was called by Jesus. We also know him as the author of 1st and 2nd Peter. As I mentioned earlier, Matthew 8:14 is how we know that he was married, where it says, Now when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother lying sick with this fever. Other translations will say his mother-in-law was sick, so at least it tells us that he went and he healed her and that he was at least married. He also seems to have been one of the spokesmen for the group. He asked the meaning of the difficult passage in 15:10, that passage. When he had called his multitude to himself, he said to them, Hear and understand, not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what goes out of the mouth, this defiles a man. And after hearing that, Peter answered and said to him, Explain the parable to us. Then Jesus went on and made the discourse about, it's really what comes out of the mouth that's the problem. 18:21, then Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times. And we looked at this the last couple of weeks over some of the responses of Jesus with the parables. And Lord went on to tell him the parable of that, about how many times we should forgive. And then finally in 19:27, then Peter answered and said to him, See, we have left all and followed you. Therefore, what shall we have? And this one kind of seems like one of those that probably the apostles have been talking amongst themselves, thinking to themselves, we've left everything for you, Lord. What, like anybody would, what are we going to get out of this? And it kind of seems like they probably were all saying, Peter, go up and ask Jesus, what are we going to get out of this? So Peter goes up and asks him that question. Here's a couple of other things that we know about Peter. He was the first that were recorded to confess Jesus as the Christ. In 16:16, where it says, Simon Peter answered and said, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He was one of the 3 that Jesus picked to go up on the Mount of the Transfiguration with him in 17:4. It says, Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And again, he was the one of 3 chosen to go with Jesus in the garden to pray during his final hours, and that's in 26:37. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, which are James and John, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. And I think as much as, Peter, we look up to him for obviously being an apostle, a writer of the words, a couple other books, as being one of the closest apostles to Jesus. I think it's important that we also look, he actually, he had a human side to him. If you remember, he walked on the water, but then when his face started going, he ended up sinking. You see this in 14:30. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. If you remember, he stood up for Jesus, but then just right after that, got rebuked by Jesus in 16:23. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, you are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men. If you remember, we just talked about that. He was chosen to go up with Jesus up to the Transfiguration. He got to view the Transfiguration, but it appears really to have totally missed the point of what was going on. You remember, he said, Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And I thought it was interesting in the response. I think Jesus could have explained to him the error of his ways, but it appears Jesus really didn't respond. He didn't respond. He just kind of went on with what he was talking about. But at least at this point, Peter it seems, kind of has missed the point of what went on up there. Fourthly, he was chosen to go into the garden but fell asleep. In chapter 26, 44 and 45. So he left them, went away again, and prayed the third time, saying the same words. So it's happened twice already. So here's the third time that Jesus has kind of gone to be by himself. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners." And finally, we talked about just a minute ago, he was the first to confess Jesus, but he confessed Jesus first, but he also denied him 3 times in 26, 74, and 75. Then he began to curse and swear, saying, "I do not know the man." So this is Peter talking after he's been confronted about Jesus. "I do not know the man." And immediately a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the word of Christ, who had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So he went and wept bitterly. And I think what's important about Peter is how he handled those failures. We're going to look in a minute at Judas, and he had a big failure, and he handled it one way, whereas Peter was able to handle it a different way. Peter grew in his mistakes and went on to be a much better person, whereas Judas wasn't able to deal with his. All right, his brother Andrew. Again, we know he's from Bethsaida. We read that in John 1:44. He was also a fisherman with his brother when called by Jesus, brother of Peter. One thing we do find out about him over in John 1:40 through 42 is that he's the one that brought Peter to Jesus. It says, "One of the 2 who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. But he first found his brother Simon and said to him, 'We have found the Messiah,' which is translated the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Now when Jesus looked at him, he said, 'You are Simon the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas,' which is translated a stone." So, a big thing with Andrew, he went out and found his brother. He thought the first thing he wanted to do when he heard about Jesus was go tell somebody, and his brother was who came to mind. Now, obviously, Peter went on to do great things, so Andrew, made a good decision there to get his brother. One of the few things we really know about Andrew, we find out in John 6, 8, and 9, he had enough faith to bring up the lad who had the 5 loaves and 2 fishes that ended up feeding the 5,000 men. Yet he had doubts about what Jesus would do about it or do with it. That one says, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. What are they among so many?" So I think at the point, he probably had seen Jesus do a lot of miracles, so I think in the back of his mind, he thought, well, here's a start. It just doesn't seem like maybe he was fully convinced that Jesus would be able to do something as big as feed. It mentions 5,000 men, so it easily could have been 15 or 20,000 people that he had, and he had this small little meal, so it would be a big stretch to think that. So there seems to be a little bit of doubt, but at least he had the kind of the gumption to go up to Jesus and at least approach him with it. All right, James, the son of Zebedee. Again, another one that's from Bethsaida, was a fisherman in Capernaum when he was called. He's the brother of John. These 2 brothers over in Mark 3:17 are called the sons of thunder. It says, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name, I'm going to butcher this, Boanerges, that is, or translates son of thunder. He asked to sit Jesus beside Jesus in his kingdom in Mark 10:37. So he goes up, and another one approaches Jesus, and they said to him, "Grant us that we may sit, one on your right hand and the other on your left, in your glory." Probably not really knowing the full extent of what this question was. I think they, again, probably were thinking of some kind of earthly kingdom that Jesus was going to be beginning, and they're hoping to be put into a high place of honor there, or sit up kind of like, if we do our deal, so Jesus being the president, they're kind of wanting to maybe be the vice president of this new kingdom that's going to be established. James was in the inner circle with Jesus again. He was at the Transfiguration, where it mentions now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, led them on a high mountain by themselves. There they were able to witness what went on in the Transfiguration. He was again taken in the garden to pray with Jesus right near the end of his life, and he took with him Peter and the two sons of thunder, which are James and John. This is a kind of an interesting side note on James too, that it's recorded over in Luke 9. If you remember, they had been walking to a Samaritan village, and they were trying to get some stuff prepared for Jesus, and they didn't accept him. And so James wanted to actually call down fire and destroy the village, and it says here in Luke 9:52. And as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. But they did not receive him, because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just as Elijah did?" And if you remember, they're looking back at Elijah up on Mount Carmel when he's doing this. He has all the prophets of Baal, and I think there were some 400 of them or so, prophets of Baal. And after they spent half a day doing all kinds of odd things, trying to get their sacrifice or the fire to burn and so forth, it didn't work. So finally Elijah has his totally covered in water, and then fire comes down and basically destroys it all, burns up everything. So I think that's what they had in mind, where they were saying, "Lord, do you want us to actually call for fire to come down?" Here's his brother John, both sons, we know them as sons of Zebedee. Again, Bethsaida. Brother of James, author of the book of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation. Again, he was in the inner circle, the Transfiguration, in prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. We know a little bit about John. He served out the latter part of his life in exile on an Isle of Patmos. We'll see later, John's also one of only a couple that were martyred for their faith. It appears that he lived to be really old, maybe even up to the 90s possibly. It was here out on the Isle of Patmos that's where he probably wrote Revelations. We see in Revelations 1:9, it says, "I, John, both your brother and companion in the tribulation, in kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ, was on the island that is called Patmos for the word of God and for the testimony of Jesus Christ." If you remember that, he goes on then, he's seeing a vision, goes on to describe that vision and writes it down, and that's what we have as the book of book of Revelations, excuse me. John's also the one that was chosen to take care of Jesus' mother Mary. Jesus asked him to do that while on the cross. We see that in John 19:26 and 27. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciples whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, that disciple took her into his own home. Also, Apostle John is kind of known as the Apostle of Love due to a lot of love being an important theme of a lot of his writings. Probably one of the most quoted verses in the Bible, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life." So the Apostle John, again, known to a lot as the Apostle of Love, or wrote about love a lot. All right, what do we know about Philip? He's the last of the ones that we know is from Bethsaida. We again heard that in 1 John, where it says, "The following day Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, 'Follow me.' Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter." One thing we find out is that he brought Nathanael, so another one of the apostles, to Jesus in John 1:45 and 46. Here it says, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, "Come and see." One of the few exchanges that we have about Philip is it was kind of it's a testing by Jesus, it appears, in John 1:5-7. It says, "Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?' But this he said to test him, for he knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little." You know, again, the humanity comes out, kind of like Andrew we saw earlier, tested about. I think deep down he thought Jesus could do it or would have the means to do it, but just wasn't quite certain that Jesus would have the power or the ability maybe to feed all these people that he was asking him about. And finally, on Philip, he was rebuked by Jesus. We see that in John 14:7-9. "If you have known me, you would have known my Father also. And from now on, you know him and have seen him." Philip said to him, "Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us." Jesus said to him, "Have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me and has seen the Father, so how can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" So again, like a lot of us would, Philip just didn't quite understand the full extent of what he was asking about, or what this relationship between Jesus and his Father. All right, Bartholomew, also known as Nathanael, it just mentions he was from Cana in Galilee in John 21:2. We see that. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee. And here he was introduced to Jesus through Philip. Over in John 1:45 it said, "Philip found Nathanael and said to him, 'We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." If you see his response here, he was actually pretty skeptical about what Philip was telling him. In John 1:46, and Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And I was thinking, if he would have known, the prophecies foretell Jesus of being or growing up in Nazareth. So possibly, I don't know if he just didn't remember that one or didn't understand that prophecy, but Nazareth would have been a logical place for the Lord to come based upon the prophecies. It says that Jesus knew about him in John 1:47-50. It says, "Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, 'Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit.' And Nathanael said to him, 'How did you know me?' or 'How do you know me?' Jesus answered and said to him, 'Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you.' Nathanael answered and said to him, 'Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel.' Jesus answered and said to him, 'Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these.'" So it just took Nathanael a little bit of convincing, but as soon as Jesus basically told him something that he wouldn't have known other than being Jesus, it changed his mind. All right, Thomas, we just know he's from Galilee. The name means twin. He's sometimes referred to that in Scripture. In John 11:16, it says, "Then Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples." We find out over in John 11:14-16 that he doesn't appear to be afraid to die for the Lord. Then Jesus said to them plainly, so remember this is the apostles are with him. Lazarus is dead. He's explaining to them. They kind of ask him, well, maybe he's just sleeping. He says, no, Lazarus is dead. "And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him." Then Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Here's just the verses. You know, I think we kind of grow up hearing Thomas. Remember him, he's being talked about sometimes as doubting Thomas. Here's the scripture where we're getting a lot of that from. John 20, verses 24 through 29 says, "And now Thomas, called a twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, 'We have seen the Lord.' So he said to them," so to set a little scene here, this is after Jesus is risen. And they're telling him, "I've seen him," and he's skeptical about it. He says, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, "Peace to you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here, and look at my hands, and reach your hand here, and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." I can imagine when Jesus appeared and he actually basically repeated what Thomas had said in the company of the men when Jesus wasn't there. You know, I think there was probably a lot of surprise in him when Jesus knew exactly what he had asked, even though he hadn't been there when it was asked. All right, Matthew, the writer of our book, and you would think being one of the gospel writers, but really there's very little known about Matthew outside of a few things that we're going to look at. He was encountered by Jesus in Capernaum, but not sure we mentioned if that's where he was actually from. His calling was very similar to a lot of them as Jesus passed on from there. This is in Matthew 9:9. He saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office and said to him, "Follow me." So he arose and followed him. Of course, we know him as the author of this book that we're studying, Matthew. We talked about earlier being the tax collector and what a job that would have been, and how we found her. I found it really interesting that Jesus called someone that would be, from a political standpoint, would be in direct opposite probably from the rest of the men that he called, but yet he called him anyway. He's really only mentioned in the other three Gospels for his calling when they talk about how the apostles were called. But as I mentioned here, to be an author of one of the Gospels, and yet not much else is known about him. James, the son of Alphaeus, again from Galilee. Again, another one that not much is mentioned about him. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion. He's one of three James that are mentioned in the New Testament. You know, there's James, the son of Alphaeus, James, the son of Zebedee, and then James, the brother of Jesus, who was a leader in the early church and a writer of the book of James. So the apostle was not the writer of the book of James, so sometimes there's a little bit of confusion with that. So there's really kind of three James that are mentioned. He's also known as James the Less in Mark. We hear there also that his mother was named Mary in Mark 15:40. There were also women looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less, and of Joseph and Salome. So I don't know, but maybe we could say that there's a good chance that he had converted his mom. She's mentioned a couple times, she seems to have followed Jesus along, maybe even administered to him, was in the same group as Mary Magdalene. So I think it's nice to think that maybe he had converted his mom and she was now a believer. There's one thing, and this is not with just James the son of Alphaeus, but several of these apostles that are really obscure. You know what? I think I forgot to switch this. I'm sorry. There we go. I'm on the last point now. Being an obscure apostle we need to realize, didn't make it any less important than those like Peter, James, and John, nor does it lessen the reward that Jesus promised to his apostles. And really what we're called to do, whether we spend our whole life in obscurity or whether we spend it in the spotlight, is obedience to Jesus Christ is what we're called to do. And that's what some of these apostles, like I say, they were with Jesus every day. They had an incredibly close relationship with him. But for whatever reason, we're just not chosen to have received much more information about him. But again, being obscure is not a bad thing. They still would have been able to be a part of all what had been promised to the other apostles. Thaddeus. He really actually has 4 names. It's kind of confusing at times. And he's referred to as Thaddeus in Matthew and Mark, but yet in the New King James Version in Matthew, he is referred to as Labius, whose surname was Thaddeus. In Luke, though, he replaces the name Thaddeus with Judas, son of James, and in both Luke 16:16 and Acts 1:13. And when the Apostle John mentions Thaddeus, he calls him Judas and puts in parentheses every time not Iscariot to make sure we weren't thinking about that he was referring to Judas Iscariot. Really, the only speaking of him is in John 14:22 through 24. It says, Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. He who does not love me does not keep my word, and the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father who sent me. All right, we're getting close on time here. All right, Simon the Canaanite, again from Galilee, referred to as Simon the Zealot in Luke. This may have been a reference. There was a party that was getting started about this time called the Zealots, and they were really big on pushing for Jewish independence and throwing off Roman rule. So it's possible that this kind of name went along with him because he's part of that political group. Again, he would have been completely different political spectrum ends with Matthew. He was huge about getting away from Rome, whereas Matthew was employed by Rome himself. And really, from that extent, we know nothing more about Simon the Canaanite. Finally, the last one, Judas Iscariot, we do know some about him, obviously. I mentioned this earlier. His name could mean interpretation of man from Kerioth. It appears he was at least the treasurer or had something to do with keeping up with the money in John 12:6. This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put into it. Sadly, he's really the most well-known disciple because of his betrayal for Jesus in that aspect. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you? And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time, he sought the opportunity to betray him. I'm sorry, we're kind of going through this a little quickly, but it was also predicted by Jesus. If you remember, they're all sitting together, and Jesus said to him, surely I say one of you will betray me. And they were exceedingly sorrowful, and each began to say to him, Lord, is it I? And he answered and said, it is he who dipped his hand with me in the dish will betray me. Obviously, at this point, Judas knows that the Lord knows what's about to happen. And I've often wondered at this point, because he goes on, he goes on to tell what's going to happen to him being had good for that man if he had not even been born. You would have think when he heard that he would possibly have been starting to second guess himself as to betraying Jesus, but it doesn't appear that he did. I'll skip through this one. If you remember, he led the people to Jesus, had that deal that there was a kiss, which I've often thought was odd. I think in 3 years I don't think any of these chief priests or elders would have not known who Jesus was. So I'm not really sure why they needed someone to come up and kiss him in the first place to point him out. And then finally, this is just the Acts, the account. Yeah, I've got to go. This is finally the account in Acts that we see where Judas took his own life, and it describes that when he realized what he had done finally. And finally, one thing that I did find interesting, we'll end here today, is how did the apostles die? And we'll go through that really quick. Andrew, and some of these, or most of this, I had to get out from kind of extra biblical literature. Some of them, there's some differences on how they think he died, but this is kind of, what I put up here is kind of what the consensus of it is, but at least gives you an idea of what these men went through. It says, Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. Bartholomew said he was flayed alive with knives. James, the son of Zebedee, is the only recorded martyr. That's in Acts 12, 1 through 2. James, the son of Alphaeus, was sawn in pieces. John, we talked about, the only one to die of natural causes. Judas Iscariot hung himself. Thaddeus, it talks about, was killed with arrows. Matthew was martyred, possibly in Ethiopia. Peter was crucified like Christ, but because he didn't want to be crucified in the same way, asked them to do it, crucify him upside down. Philip, it appears, died by hanging. Simon the Canaanite died a martyr's death, we do know, but uncertain on how it. And Thomas, it says, was killed with a spear. So that is all I had for today. Sorry it ran a little bit over, but thank y'all very much. And we will continue next week.